Welcome back to Under Oath. I have Jonathan Sacerdoti from the Jewish Chronicle. We're going to talk about some problems we're having in the world right now, particularly dealing with the war in Israel and dealing with Hamas. This is a tough time for, I think, not only Israel, but I think Jews all over the planet, because we've just discovered something that we're very surprised at, that, people we thought were our friends probably aren't.
I've heard from a lot of Jewish people at the moment who are really distressed because something absolutely horrific happened to Israelis on the 7th of October with the invasion of Hamas into civilian areas of Israel. People were kidnapped, tortured, raped, and killed in enormous numbers, something like 1,400, I think. And there are still 200 or more believed to be held hostage at the moment in the Gaza Strip after Hamas invaded and took them back there. No sign of life from them, no word from them. I think that Jewish people around the world have obviously been deeply shocked and upset by that news, because almost all Jewish people in the world have some form of connection, if not a very deep one, to the state of Israel. A lot of them have family and friends and relatives there. So I think that when Jewish people in the diaspora outside Israel have found that their friends and neighbors have, let's say, been less than understanding, have maybe not checked in with them, not shown much sympathy, or worse, shown some form of animosity towards Israel as it tries to fight back against that terrorist organization that did that, I think it's been an eye-opener, as you said, and plenty of people I speak to are now quite afraid, having gone from one moment living very fulfilled, happy, integrated Jewish lives in their society, to feeling like they're not really sure who's really a true friend or where they're actually safe.
It was strange. I served in the Middle East when I served actually part of the multinational force where we camped out in between Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that's what has maintained the peace between those three countries. And I always wondered why we didn't try to do the same when it came to the Palestinians and Israel. Why didn't we just set up bases in between all, basically around the border and say, okay, if you want to fight this war, you got to go through us first, which that seems to work between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Is the fear that that won't work here because of it's just unbelievably too volatile?
Well, firstly, thank you for your service. It's important to say. And secondly, I'd say this, that Israel's very adamant that it should protect itself and that it doesn't want protection from others. I think we can see, in a sense, why that's happening in their ideology, if we look both back into history and at now. So historically, the shadow of the Holocaust looms over all Jewish people's memories and always will do when 6 million Jewish people were killed by Nazi Germany. I think that after that, with the foundation of the modern state of Israel, there was the attitude that this must never happen again. And the way to ensure it never happened again was to fulfill the Zionist dream of having a Jewish state, and a state that can protect itself with its own military and its own army. And when we look forwards to now, for example, in the north, Iran's proxy there, which is Hezbollah, is also becoming active in trying to wage war with Israel in conjunction with Hamas in the south. And I think that there are peacekeeping forces up there. There are forces that are meant to keep the peace between Lebanon and Israel. And generally speaking, I don't think peacekeeping forces can keep the peace so much when war breaks out. Often it's a very good deterrent. And I think America's support for Israel right now is incredibly important in that respect. It's bolstered its presence in the region, especially with those strike groups in the Mediterranean and the presence there. And they are saying that that's there to stop any kind of action from the north and to discourage other players from joining in. However, if and when they do, I'm not sure that the US is going to support having boots on the ground, for example. And Israel is well aware that it wants to look after itself and protect itself against its enemies. Not to say it's ungrateful, though, for that US support. That's important to add.
Well, that's not what I'm saying, Jonathan. What I'm saying is that we've been there for over 40 years. The multinational force and observers that camp out, I mean, we're talking hundreds of soldiers, sit between Egypt and Israel. And that was part of the peacekeeping, that was part of the peace treaty that the U.S. England, Italy, Guam, and I think there's another country. And I walked the Sinai Desert for 6 months to make sure that and Egypt knows if they want to get into Israel, they have to go through a U.S. base to get there. So I
Yeah.
don't see a real difference between that peace treaty and possibly one that should have been done before this war.
Well, I think
That could have existed.
I certainly don't have your experience of being there on the ground in the forces, so I absolutely hear that with interest, and I will say that
Yeah.
it is important for Israel, and not just for Israel, for its neighbors to have the support, especially of the United States. Ultimately, the US is the world superpower, which is the peacekeeper of the whole planet. I mean, there is no doubt about that its actions and its military are vitally important in especially to its allies like Israel. I think that there will be many versions of what could happen after this, and perhaps you're right that if different strategies had been pursued before, things could have been different. But now we are where we are, and I think that there's a lot of questions about what will happen after this war is over, whenever that might be. That will depend a lot on what happens and how many people are killed and what happens territorially and strategically, and whether Hamas can be fully erased and wiped out, and whether the Iranian threat in the region is diminished substantially enough that it's less of a threat to Israel. And I absolutely agree with you that the Americans and other nations will have to play an important part in that, because one of the things that does keep Israel and therefore the Western world safe is the sense among its enemies that it's not just Israel. There is a combined group of people, of countries, of militaries which value the same things: freedom, democracy, peace. And it is because those countries have those shared values and ideals that they will stand up together against terrorists who will do things like invade nursery schools and butcher babies, or burn families alive tied together with metal cable. I think we mustn't forget what started this war, and we mustn't forget that it's vital that it shouldn't be able to happen again. And when we look at what's happening in the region, we therefore need to think very hard about what strategies should be used against an adversary like that, while still maintaining a respect for civilian populations who are caught up in between this, but eliminating those kinds of forces of evil.
One of the things that I grew up with this feeling, always remember the Holocaust, always remember, always remember. We have problems now. Biggest problem is that we can show a video of all this happening. In fact, Israel just dumped a bunch of videos of the atrocities that happened, and people are going, I don't care. I'm not going to look at it. I don't believe it. They're closing their minds to it, and they're set in a certain belief that it doesn't matter. We have congressmen in the U.S. who are actually putting out false narratives. When does it get to the truth where the message is more important than the truth? And I think that's what's happening all over.
You're not wrong that there's a lot of disinformation now involved in wars. I think there always was, but we just have such a speed of communication and ease of communication for even ordinary people sitting at home that it's become more and more dangerous. And as you say, I think there's been a fair amount of that already in the just over 2 weeks of this war. We've seen false allegations about Israel supposedly bombing a hospital in Gaza, which turned out to be a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired and landed in the car park of the hospital. Either way, thank goodness, the civilian casualty numbers are now assumed to be much lower than the false numbers initially given out by Hamas. For example, it's just one piece of misinformation that mobilized thousands of people on the streets around the Middle East, and then actually got in the way of President Biden's visit to Israel. He had a summit planned with various of Israel's neighbors in order to try to calm the situation down and possibly achieve some form of humanitarian relief within Gaza, and also perhaps some of the release of these over 200 hostages that Hamas is keeping, that it grabbed from Israel. All of that got really impeded by this false news story that animated so many people on the streets in various countries around the Middle East. I think that's just one example of how that fake information, false news, if you will, is now a really important part of how wars map out, because it has real effects on the actions of different people, whether they're at government level, military level, or on the street. And all of those, of course, are also connected, because governments and militaries have to act according to what's going on the street as well. So I do agree with you that we have really a massive problem now with trying to follow what's going on and not be distracted by fake footage, fake news, fake claims. And of course, there are those who make the same claims about Israel. But I think that given the two sides of it, Israel has an army which regularly investigates its own shortcomings and errors, and Hamas is a terrorist organization which wantonly and deliberately targets civilians for rape, murder, torture, and kidnap. And so one needs to remember that as well when assessing the information on both sides.
Following the money trail is always important in figuring out who's financing this terror. And the U.S. just basically opened up $5 billion to the Iranian government with the promise that this money wouldn't go to fund terrorism. But if the money is paying off other areas, let's say food and stuff like that, then they could use that money that they were going to put towards it to somewhere else. So it really doesn't matter where they put this $5 billion as long as they're allocating other funds to terrorism. I mean, what are we actually looking at here?
Well, I think that's right. There were that vast amount of money which was released to Iran in return for hostages. And I think that has proven, just by its proximity to what's happened now, to have been controversial, to say the least, if not very problematic. As you say, if there was any guarantee that that wasn't going to be spent on military or terror or war efforts, well, that's really a false way of thinking about things. It's sort of tin pot accounting. You know, if you free up that amount of money for anything else, it gives Iran the ability to spend where it wants to, and it certainly does seem to have wanted to spend in Gaza. Gaza, we were told for so long, had a blockade, a siege by Israel. Well, it doesn't seem to have had any trouble getting weaponry and even training and potentially personnel in and out in order to carry out quite an audacious and successful attack on Israel, which has one of the most impressive militaries in the region or the world. So I think that we can see that where Iran wants to, it's able to act. And while those sanctions on Iran for many years had been crippling, I think a mixture of the money that was released just recently, but also of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was made under Obama, cancelled under President Trump, I think those have also been important moments, because the more isolated Iran was and the less able it was to resource its terror activities around the world, the less likely something like this would be to happen. And the more those restraints were loosened, the more able it became. I wouldn't say, though, that it was just Iran. I think also there is now a big debate in Israel about Israel's own policy towards Gaza and specifically Hamas in previous years. It's clear that it failed in what it was trying to do. Israel had for some time pursued a policy of containment of Hamas. Many had even accused Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, of, in a way, bolstering Hamas, because it enabled him to push down the line the possibility of creating a Palestinian state. If the Palestinians were divided between the more moderates and Hamas, then he could say there was nobody to create a state. But he was, of course, right, because Hamas took over control of the Gaza Strip after the Israelis withdrew from it very quickly and never let go. But rather than crush Hamas in the past, he enabled Hamas to be funded, back to money, by Qatar. So Qatari money was allowed into Gaza to fund Hamas. Why did he do that? He did that in part because he believed, it would seem, that there was a level of peace being kept, and that Hamas was concentrating more on looking after the people of Gaza. In fact, it turns out he was wrong, if that's what he thought, that Hamas was actually quietly planning an extremely bold move, which we're told was probably a year or more in the making. They've been training very hard for this. And if that's what they've been doing with that extra money coming in, and with that apparent relaxing of some of the restrictions from Israel, for example, many thousands of Gazans were allowed into Israel with work permits in order to enable them to earn a living. If those things actually have created the situation we see today, I think we'll look back and see this as a massive, grave error, as you said, largely because of vast amounts of money pouring into the wrong pockets.
There's also a concept. We have the same issue here. The people don't understand why Israel's letting these people come across this border. And it's because this is, let's just say, inexpensive labor. These are people who want to do jobs that typical Israelis don't want to do. The same reasons why, for example, in the U.S., we have a lot of immigrants coming across the border. They're not stealing our jobs. They're doing jobs we don't want to do. And I think that's a huge problem in Israel, that most of these people coming across the border are doing jobs they don't want to do. And I think this plays into the fact that you create your own problems in situations like that.
Well, I think immigration everywhere in the world works on that balance, which is between, as you say, jobs that people in the host country don't necessarily want to do for small enough amounts, and people from other places who are desperate for work and for income and will therefore come in and do the work at a lower wage. Certainly that would have been part of Israel's calculation and equation. I think also, to be fair to Israel, there was also maybe some aspect of trying to coexist alongside even an extreme area like Gaza, with Hamas, an extremist, genocidal, racist terror group, ruling it. The point is, you can't choose your neighbors. And so while cheap labor might have been part of it, I think there was also an assumption that if Palestinians were given more work permits, and it's not just work permits, Israel also let in many Palestinians for medical treatment, which was not something that necessarily made them money. It was humanitarian. All of that, of course, has ended now, and I can't see how it will be easily resumed. It's in order to better the lives of the neighboring country, again, for selfish reasons. If you can make ordinary Gazans more prosperous, even with what would seem like a low wage to most Israelis, if you can make them healthier and able to access healthcare more readily, if you can give them more semblance of a normal life, then you might hope that they reject the kind of extremism that sees over 1,000 of them pour into the country, attacking civilians in the way that they did. I think that Israel has learned a lesson there, which is it can't make those assumptions. And that's not something I think it's going to do again readily. So in a sense, it's tragic for the Palestinian cause as well, because it's set it back decades. I cannot see how anyone in Israel at the moment, on the left or the right, will be keen to pursue those sorts of policies again quickly. And it's worth just adding, by the way, that large numbers of the people who were killed, raped, attacked, tortured, and taken hostage are actually from Israel's traditionally left-wing peace camp. That is to say, people who would previously have been very, very much open to trying to create two states, trying to have much more favorable conditions for the Palestinians, trying to make peace according to less hawkish means. That festival that was attacked, the music festival, was predominantly attended by exactly those kinds of people. I've seen countless stories of those killed and tortured and kidnapped, which told of people who dedicated their lives to making other people's lives better, both Palestinians or Africans or people around the world who have less money, less welfare, less income, less access to healthcare. It's those people who they have killed indiscriminately, just as much as they killed anybody else within Israel. And I think that that's also a harsh lesson, really, that both sides are going to learn. There's just going to be so much less trust there.
Well, Jonathan, I can't thank you enough for being on the show. Keep doing what you're doing. I know you do a lot of other causes. I appreciate you for being on the show, Jonathan, and hopefully we'll have you again.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.